haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Tzadik Aleph Amud Aleph, starting with Daf Peites Amud Beis, 7 lines from the bottom, the second wide line. The Gemara speaks over here about when one is memane a korban Pesach. Says the Gemara, Tonu Rabbanan bring the following brisa: Hamemane acherim imoy al pischoi val chagigosoi. When one appoints others to be included in his korban Pesach or his korban chagiga, which is Yud Dalid, those who are included in the korban Pesach will eat the korban chagiga, and then after having svia, they'll eat the korban Pesach al hasoiva. It says over here, Ma'o shebi yodoi chulin. The money that is in his hands will be chulin. The brisa continues, V'hamoicher oilosoi ushlamov loy osav lo klum. One who sells his korban oila or korban shlomim is not a valid sale. Umos kol shehein yiplu nedova. And the money from that sale, any amount of it will then go towards nedova. In other words, when a person is trying to sell those offerings for somebody else to get a kapara, it's invalid. The only one who can then use that korban will go toward the bailim. And therefore, since the sale is invalid, it says over here in the brisa, nonetheless, the money will then go to Nedava for then the communal korban oila offerings. The Gemara says, if you're saying in the latter part of the brisa that when one sells his korban oila or korban shlomim, it's not a valid sale. So then, if that's the case, most amay yiplu nedava, then why does the money go towards the communal oila offerings? Hare, the sale didn't happen. Says the Gemara, marove knasa, it's a penalty, so that the one who is buying such a korban, that he should then effect a kapara for himself, he will be discouraged from doing so in the future. Ask the Gemara, my kol shehein, what is this addition that any amount of the money should fall and go towards the communal offerings? Says the Gemara, Afagav de loy havu shavu ela arba, v'yahavu loy chamisha, even though it was only worth 4, and he paid 5 for it. Afilu b'ayisei nami kansu rabbanan. Not only the 4 is that penalized, but even the 5th that you might say is not really the cost of the korban, but really more like a gift to the seller, that also is penalized, and all 5 will go towards the communal offerings. Omar Ula v'yitem Rabbi Oshaya, Efshir yadei chavroim b'Vaviloi taim medahai milsa. He says, halavai, that our comrades in Bavel would know the reason for this matter, meaning the ratio of this brisa, as follows: Ze hifrish tle lepischoi, v'ze hifrish mos lepischoi. Here we're talking about where one, he then separated a lamb for a korban Pesach. In other words, he consecrated the lamb to be now a korban Pesach. Then that's Ruvain who then consecrated the lamb. Then Shimon, he wants to then be included in that chabura, in that designation for that korban Pesach. So then Shimon gives money towards that lamb to Reuven. So it states in the brisa that the Mosar should be yada chulin. Ask the Gemara, heich hekdesh chal al hekdesh. How can the money that is hekdesh, when Shimon then gives the money, he's giving it for the consecration to be included in the korban Pesach, how does that then chal on the hekdesh, which is the lamb that Reuven set aside? Diktani Moshe b'yada chulin, that it should say that money in his hands is chulin. When is money become chulin? When you take money and you then take off the kedusha from something else. So then the money itself then is able to then cause something to have kedusha on something, and then that kedusha goes onto the money. In other words, when a person then is taking an item and he wants to then take the item that doesn't have kedusha, so he puts from the kedushas hadam onto the item, so now the item will have kedusha, but the money then goes out to chulin. But over here, both items are already kadosh. The money is kadosh and the lamb is kadosh. If the lamb was not kadosh, then in a chanami, the money that you're giving that has that's sanctified will then go to the lamb to sanctify the lamb, and the money will go out b'chulin. But since over here the lamb is already sanctified, how can it be possible that the money, which is sanctified, will then go out to chulin? On top of Tzadik Aleph Amud Aleph, the Gemara now will bring the following that Abai explains. Now, the background of this is based on the Shita of Rebbe in a brisa that will be brought soon in the Gemara. The brisa states that when it comes to a carbon, then that carbon, namely a carbon Pesach, so the owner of that carbon Pesach can take that value and he can go ahead and buy things with it, even for personal use. So Rebbe can be explained in one of two ways. Rebbe can explain that either it means that the owner of the carbon Pesach, when he bought the carbon Pesach, it didn't have complete sanctity, unlike other carbonos where the entire carbon is sanctified. Over here by the carbon Pesach, it's unusual. It's only partially sanctified, whereby he can take the carbon Pesach's value and sell it to again get other items, other things that he needs for personal usage. Or alternatively, Rebbe is explaining that the reason why Korban Pesach is different is because it's already designated that the money that will then be given to the owner of the Korban Pesach, to be included as a designation in the Chabur of the Korban Pesach, that money itself is already understood to be then given to be used for other things. So this is two different explanations of how to explain Rebbe. Now this goes based on a Mishnah that is brought in Masechet Tmura. There it's talking about the Isser, the prohibition of using the money, the payment that was given to a Zoina, a harlot, that cannot be used for an offering to Hashem. So therefore, such an offering would be invalid. So it states over there in the Mishnah that if a person wants to take a carbon, which is already consecrated, that consecrated animal, if he then will then use it as a payment for a zoina, so then that will then not make the consecrated animal disqualified. Will not make it osir, prohibited. Which implies that indeed that there's some sort of ownership by the bailim in order to then be able to sell it, and I would think that it would become prohibited, which I need the pasuk to explain otherwise. This was brought on Brisa. There's a pasuk that states that such a carbon that was already consecrated will not go out to become prohibited when it's used as a payment for a zoina. It can't be then prohibited. In other words, that still remains a carbon. Again, I would only think that if I have personal financial ownership of that animal. But if it's something that's designated to, it's already considered to be Mammon Gavoya, so then how can I ever even think that I would need to go ahead and that I would have a Havamin that could go ahead and sell it? The fact that I had such a Havamin, I could sell it, and it could become prohibited, and I need a pasuk to teach me otherwise, implies that I have some sort of financial ownership of this animal. And this is how Abai is going to explain. The Gemara will then, it will be unfolded in this Gemara as the Gemara explains now. Omar Abai says, Ilav de ukmei Rebbe Oshaya, lahi b'mamane zoina al pischoy. If it wasn't that Rebbe Oshaya explained this Brisa to mean, this Mishnah, which is referring to the Mishnah in Tmura, to mean that we're talking about where one includes a zoina in his Korban Pesach. That's the payment that he gives to the zoina as having her being part of this Korban Pesach. V'Rebbehi, and Rebbe's opinion, Hava mukminon la lahahi bekochim kalim valid with Rebbe Yossi Aglili. I would have explained it to refer to not as a Korban Pesach, but as kochim kalim, like the sheet of Rebbe Yossi Aglili. The Omar kochim kalim b'mam bailim who explains Rebbe Yossi Aglili that kochim kalim is such that there is ownership by the bailim, the one who then will bring the carbon, whereby he can go ahead and sell the carbon. Whereby that would be the case over here that we're referring to. But that's how I would explain it had it not been from Rav Oshaya. Aval Pesach lo mishayir inish. But when it comes to Korban Pesach, I would say different than Rav Oshaya. I would say that, unlike Rav Oshaya was saying that like the first tzad that we said before, that the Korban Pesach is not completely sanctified, I would have said no, says Abai. I would have explained it to mean that the Korban Pesach be'etzem is completely sanctified. Lo mishayir inish. A person does not leave anything for himself to be unsanctified. B'mos vade mishayir inish. Rather, the money instead, which is given for somebody to be designated, including that Korban Pesach, that is not completely sanctified. That's already given with an understanding that the owner of the Korban Pesach will be able to use that money. That in the onset, when he set aside the money, it was with this intention that he can go ahead and use the money for his personal use. So in other words, according to this, the way that Abai is explaining, that would mean that the money would go to Chulin. And the way that Rabbi Oshaya would say it before, that the actual animal itself is not completely consecrated. So then, therefore, since there's part of it that's unconsecrated, then it's understood also that the person could go ahead and use that part that's unconsecrated, whereby the money will go to Chulin. So that would those two explanations would explain what we said before in that brisa, that how the money will still go out to Chulin. Says the Gemara, V'ha Rebbe, and this brisa is Rebbe, u'mishum hachi mo shebiyodoi Chulin. And because this brisa that we just quoted before, the money that goes out is Chulin, again, with either explanation of Rav Oshaya or the explanation of Abaye. Either the explanation of Rav Oshaya that since it's not completely consecrated as a Korban Pesach, but some of it is left itself as unconsecrated, so therefore, Memele can go ahead and use that unconsecrated part, whereby the money will go to Chulin, or according to Abaye's explanation, where the money itself was given with the understanding that it will be unconsecrated and he can use it for his personal use. And therefore the money for sure he left aside according to this explanation that Abai is giving in the name of Rebbe. And the way that Rabbi Oshaya explains in the Mishnah in Tmura, like he explained like Rebbe, I would not have explained it that way. Abai says, Ana Kerebi the Bezach lo mishayir inish, because I would explain again. Abai just repeats this difference. He says I would explain differently. I would explain that the Korban Pesach is not explained that it's not completely sanctified. It is completely sanctified because that's how regular korbanos are given. They're taken. They're acquired with complete sanctity. One is makdish the korban. But over here, by Korban Pesach, I would say it's the money that's not completely sanctified. The whole leko and the brisa, and this brisa, leka lu'uk Rabbi Yossi, the brisa we had quoted before on the bottom of Amud Beis, that cannot be explained like Rabbi Yossi, even if we explain the Mishnah like Rabbi Yossi Galili, but it could not be that the brisa would be like Rabbi Yossi Galili. Why? The hot tani bo, because it's taught in the brisa. One who sells his korban oil or korban shlomim, so it's not a good sale. So the fact that the price is not a good sale, that would not shtim with Rabbi Yosef Glili. Because why? V'hashta de ukme Rabbi Yoshaya lahi b'mane zoyna al pischoy v'Rebbihi. Oh, fine. That can be like Rabbi Yosef Glili. V'hashta, and now the ukme Rabbi Yoshaya lahi b'mane zoyna al pischoy, and now that Rabbi Yoshaya explains the Mishnah in Tmura to be referring to that a person who he gives a designation of the Korban Pesach to a zona for a payment to be part of the Korban Pesach. So we can derive that Rabbi Shai explains Rebbe to be that when a person does then take a Korban Pesach and he does sanctify it, it doesn't completely come consecrated. Again, partially it's still left unconsecrated, and whereby the mamon is yotze lechulin. Now the Gemara wants to go back and explain the source for what we just said. My Rebbe, the Rebbe Oshaya. What is My Hidi Rabbi Yoshaya. Sorry, what is this that Rabbi Yoshaya said? Now we're going to bring Rabbi Yoshaya as the source where he states this in the Mishnah in Tmura, as we explained before. This now, it says in the Mishnah in Tmura, Nasan la mukdashin ke'esnana. A person gave sanctified animals, mukdashin, for his payment to a harlot, to a zona. Hare elu mutarin. Still, those are mutarin. Those animals, those mukdashin, remain mutar. Oifos the chulin, however, those have not been sanctified, those birds. Hare elu asurin. They have not been sanctified as offerings. Behold, they are asur if he gives those as a payment for a zoina. Shaya bedin. The Gemara says, because I could have explained otherwise with the following logic. Uma imukdashim shamum poisil bohen ein esnon umechir chal alehen. When it comes to mukdashim, where when it gets a mum, it will poisil the animal from its ability to then be brought as a carbon, and still we say that it can't be used for a payment to a harlot, to a zoina. Oifos she'ein hamum poisil bohen ein odin she'ein esnon umechir chalein. Oifos, which is more kal, that indeed is not going to then become postel if it were to get a mum. You can still consecrate it. Certainly then it cannot be used for the payment as a esnon, for the payment to a zoina. Talmud learned, that's what I would have thought. Talmud learned, therefore the pasuk says, lekol neder. The pasuk is read in regards to the esnon, lo sovi esnon zoina, umechir kelev, beis Hashem elokecha. Do not bring the payment of a zoina or the mechir of a kelev to the beis Hashem. Lekol neder, for any offering. La toavas Hashem elokecha, it will be a toyeva, abomination for Hashem, gam shneim, both of them. So here the Gemara brings this pasuk, Talmud learned lekol neder. It says all, includes all offerings. L'rabos is a oifos, to include even oifos. So now the Gemara says, let's bring a kal v'chomer the other way. Kal v'chomer mukdoshim me'ato. Let's bring a kal v'chomer mukdoshim. Ma oifos she'ein hamum poisil bohen esnon u'mechir chal alehen. By oifos, which is more kal, they would not become possible from a mum, and still esnon is chal. The payment to a zoina is chal on them to make it osir. Mukdoshin she'amum poisil bohen ein odin she'esnon u'mechir chal alehen. Then when it comes to mukdoshin, where a cause would get a psul if it would then become a mum, certainly then esnon, the payment to a zoina, should not become chal. Talmud loyma lekol neder. Therefore it says lekol neder prat lanodor, to exclude that which is already given a vow. And therefore, if it was already then sanctified and it was then given as a payment to a zoina, we say that indeed the Torah tells us it's not chal, it remains sanctified as a carbon. So now we have to explain, l'chara means to suggest that it's not completely sanctified. It means to say that there's some ownership of the bailin, that we would have thought that indeed he could go ahead and give this as payment to the zoina and make it osir. The fact that we need the pasuk to teach me that it's not going to be osir implies that he did have the wherewithal. Only because the Torah writes neder. Holav hachi, without this hava amina, I might have thought to say mukdashim chal iser esn aleim, that indeed it would be chal and iser on these karbonos. That means to say that I have the wherewithal, I have the power to make a payment to the zoina. And we know that l'chara it's mammon gavoya. You can't oiser something that's not yours if it's mammon gavoya. Therefore, it must be that it really does have your own ownership. Rav Shaya learns on this Mishnah talking about the Karban Pesach. You can go ahead and designate the Zoina to be included in your Karban Pesach. The Rebbe, like the Shita of Rebbe. Because why? Because Rav Shaya is learning that you yourself have the Karban Pesach, which is not completely sanctified. You have part of it that belongs to you, whereby you can use it as a payment to the Zoina and include her in your Karban Pesach. Gemara asks, my Rebbe, that you're saying that's Shita's Rebbe, where do we find the source that Rebbe would say this? The Tanya, for it says in the following brayso, in regards to Karban Pesach, Im yemait habayis miyois miseh. So he explains over here that they're making a drasha on these words, Yimayit habayis. That means, if indeed there's a limitation of the money that he has for the usage, for the Korban Pesach, then it states, Miyos miseh, hachayehu miseh, sustain it by then registering other neighbors to then use money from that registration. Mikdei, so the Gemara says, Mikdei achila, v'lo mikdei mekach. The Tanna Kama says, when can you use that money? Only for eating purposes. That means to say, to use it for firewood, you can use the money to buy firewood, to roast the Korban Pesach, but not for your own, not for personal usage, for business dealings. But Rabbi now is cholik, and he says, Af b'mikdei mekach. You can even use it for your personal business dealings. That's not kashur, it's not connected to the Korban Pesach itself. Shim ein lo, because if you do not have your means, your money that you need, then you can designate somebody else to be included in your Korban Pesach and the Korban Chagiga of your Dalit, and the money will go out to Chulin. You can use that money for whatever you need. Because it was on that condition that Klal Yisrael was then makdish the Korban Pesach. That means that understood, the Torah says that the Korban Pesach itself leaves out some of the sanctity to allow the Bailim to have a personal financial ownership of that Korban. Rabbi Zera, now the Gemara brings two Amaroim that explain the machlokis between the Rebbe and the Tanna Kama that we just mentioned now. Chad Omar bi eitzim litzliyoso kuli amalo pligi de kiven de kanto de Pesach hu kiguva de Pesach. One explains that in regards to eitzim to then roast the Korban Pesach, that everybody would agree, including the Tanna Kama, that there's no argument that over there certainly it's for the Korban Pesach. It's like the Korban Pesach itself, and therefore certainly you can use the money for the Korban Pesach to buy firewood. Ki pligi, what are they arguing about? B'matzah or moror, for using the money to buy matzah or moror. Rabbanan sarvei ho'achilach ritihi. They say it's a different type of eating, and therefore you can't use your money for the Korban Pesach to buy matzah or moror. V'Rebbe sovar kiven the hachshiroi de Pesach or kigufa de Pesach. Since it's used to then eat the Korban Pesach with the Korban Pesach, so therefore you can also use your money of Korban Pesach for the matzah mor. The other Amora explains the machlok as follows: B'matzah mor nami kuli amalo pligi. Even because the matzah mor, everybody, including the Tanna Kama, will say there's no machlokes. You can use the money of Korban Pesach to buy matzah mor. The Chsiv, it says in the pasuk, "U'mal matzah mor yochluhu." The kivan de mechshirein the Pesach ninhu ki Pesach domi. Since it is needed for the making the Pesach fitting to be eaten, so therefore it's necessary for the Korban Pesach itself. Thereby, you can use the money of the Korban Pesach. It's like Korban Pesach itself. Ki pligi. What are they arguing about? The Tanna Kama and Rebbe. Likach boy chaluk, likach boy talis. If you're going to buy a cloak, you're going to buy a talis for yourself, which was for personal needs. On there's a machlokis. The Rabbanan Savre mihiyois miseh. Omer Rachman. The Torah says mihiyois miseh, teaching me hachyeyu leseh. You can then make it alive, meaning to say you can sustain it. The person can sustain it for the seh, for the Korban itself, but not for your personal use. For Rabbi Sovar hachyeyu atzmecha miseh. He learns that no, to sustain yourself from the seh. Now the Gemara goes back and asks, on that which Abai said, Olabai da Omar ilav de ukme Rabbi Oshayla he b'maman zoyna al pischoi v'Rebbe. Abai said if it had not been for Rabbi Oshaya to explain that the person sanctifies the Korban Pesach not completely, but has some sort of financial ownership still on it, whereby the opinion of Rebbe is they can use it for any type of usage, based on the machlokes that we just saw before. Heavy mugmin and labe kochim kalim v'alibud Rabbi Yosef. But Abai said, had it not been for Rabbi Oshaya, I would have explained like the shita of Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. You were talking about kochim kalim, that you have the ownership of kochim kalim, whereby you can go ahead and sell your kochim kalim. Do my kochim kalim momon bailim. Who aval Pesach loy mishar injish. But when it comes to the Korban Pesach itself, a person sanctifies the Korban Pesach completely, like all other korbanos. To ask the Gemara now, according to that, behold, it was taught explicitly, we just quoted before, that Almanas Kain Hikdishu Yisrael Spichem. The statement that we just made is that on this condition, Klal Yisrael were Makdish the Korban Pesach, is mashma, that on this condition that they left out some of the Kedusha of the Korban Pesach, leaving it to the Bailim. So that's how Rav Oshai explains it. How does Abai explain the understanding of these words that Rebbe uses, Almanas Kain Hikdishu Yisrael Spichem? Explains the Gemara, Eimor, that Abai would say, this is the kavanah of Rebbe, Sha'al Manaskin Hikdishu Yisrael Mois Pischehem, that on condition that they sanctified, Klal Yisrael sanctified the money of the Korban Pesach. That means they already understood when they give the money of the Korban Pesach, it can be used for personal usages.